Hey everybody, this is Zephaniah Francois, your emotional health advocate, and the creator of TEEA for him and her, an all natural moisturizing system of handmade products for family, which is family friendly. So let's dive right in. I am here, and if you watched my other videos on my first class, which was the introduction to emotional and experiential language, I had a whiteboard that had a lot of information relative to what emotional language was, just some kind of like points. But this time I wanted to activate the idea of you guys coming along the journey with me, and I wanted to activate more of how to use emotional and experiential language. So we're going to call this EEL 102. We already did EEL 101. All right. So I'm going to try not to be long-winded, but I'm also going to try to pace myself because moment of transparency, I get extremely nervous when I do these videos. And so what it looks like is me talking fast, trying to rush through it, and missing a lot of strong points, just missing the opportunity to just accept how I feel, like, accept the emotional part about it and not become that. So I got to slow down. I got to practice operating from love in real time. So y'all bear with me, all right? So the first thing I have on here is learning EEL, learning to operate from love in real time. So EEL is a reflection of my journey. It is my story, my testimony. And when I say that very loosely because it is transferable. And this is not me exercising ownership over it, even though it is something that God has graced me to develop. It is something that I feel is a privilege for me to even be able to share, right? Because love is my story, right? And love continues to sustain me emotionally. And that is why I believe I've been called to really, really support as many people as I can live emotionally healthy, right? So when you think about, enough of the long-windedness, but when you think about emotional health, what is the first thing that comes to mind? When you think about love, what is the first thing that comes to mind? I'm going to be erasing this too. So this is just me kind of, again, activating, wanting to show you how to apply EEL, right? So operating from love is the idea of exercising the awareness of love first, right? So the first thing we need to do is take personal responsibility. Personal responsibility makes room for awareness, right? And awareness makes room for ownership, exercising ownership over your identity. All of this goes hand in hand, right? If we're not taking personal responsibility, then we're not empowered to do something that only we can do, something that we have control over in essence. So personal responsibility is important, right? I could say take responsibility, but I want you to understand the value of it being personal to you, right? And so again, bear with me because I'm doing my best to articulate, and because I'm nervous, I'll be saying the wrong thing sometimes. But anyhow, so, all right, I'm erasing that. So the first thing we established is the first step for living emotionally healthy. And this is going to be about all things emotional health. A lot of times when we think emotional health, we sum it up to mental health. But I want to facilitate the awareness that emotional health is relative to everything, right? And so this is where I want to introduce, I'm not going to make any disclaimers until the end, right? So this is where I want to introduce, we've already established personal responsibility. Personal responsibility, this is taking longer than I wanted it to. Personal responsibility, and that makes room for ownership, personal responsibility of yourself, ownership over your identity. And why do we want to take ownership of our identity? We want to take ownership of our identity because our identity is directive. We operate from how we identify. So knowing what accounts for that is critical, very essential, right? A lot of times, and when I say how you identify, think of what you're in agreement with in any given moment in real time, right? So in order for you to identify or operate from something, you have to be in agreement with it. And this is going to be whether you're conscious of it or not, right? You can say, I don't like eating junk food, but the reality is you may actually eat junk food, right? So it shows what you're in agreement with. Just making an example. You may say you don't like to procrastinate, but you find yourself procrastinating. You may say you don't like affection. Just trying to add some context. You may say you don't like affection, but you appreciate when someone is affectionate with you, right? So however you identify, you may say, like another example, if I say that I identify as a woman, beyond that is what accounts for that, what that looks like for me, right? And so across the board, that may look different, but again, I'm just trying to throw context in first, right? When I say I identify as an athlete, that's going to be unique to me, right? Because now this is where we're learning what accounts for that. Like what is in that baseline, right? And then 101, we talked about a baseline being a pool of information. A pool of information. So anything can function as a baseline. And the reason why that's important relative to emotional health is we want to understand if we're taking personal responsibility, we're now empowered to take ownership over our identity, and we now understand the value of what accounts for our identity, right? So we're not just saying, I identify as a woman, I identify as a man, I identify as an athlete, I identify as a professional. Beyond that, we're understanding what accounts for it. Think bank account. What is in your bank account, right? That's the only thing I could think of right now. But baseline is going to be the information that accounts for how you identify, right? So the baseline is a pool of information. And so the first thing I want to facilitate is the idea of us establishing things, right? When we talk about awareness is the recognition of something that you recognize, right? But we want our awareness to be dynamic. We want it to be functional. We want it to be towards something, right? And we don't want our awareness to be static, right? We want to know that our awareness, I call it awareness in motion, right? So this is awareness that moves, right? So this is where you understand, right? If we're moving, the first thing that we're recognizing is that we have to have an origin. We have to have a beginning, right? And why is that important? Because without an origin, we don't have a starting point. We don't have a way to exercise our awareness of what accounts for how we identify. Now, this is very broad because this is unique to you, right? And so that's why, again, let's revisit personal responsibility, ownership over your identity. Right? The first step, personal responsibility, makes room for you taking ownership over your identity, which now makes room for you doing this work that we're now establishing. This is what we're doing in real time, right? So emotional and experiential language is not something hard to do in real time, but it's also not something easy to do. It's rooted in your consciousness, what you're aware of. And so now this is why I want to introduce the plane, how we do this, because these are resources we're always using, right? This is why I want to introduce TEEA. Time, energy, effort, and awareness. We're always operating in time, and time cannot be manipulated. Energy. Everything that we do happens in energy, right? Energy. It takes energy. Effort, which is energy output, right? Any effort to lay down, to get up, to go, whatever you're doing, you're exercising some form of effort. So that's always active. If you're laying down doing nothing, you're still activating some level of effort, right? Awareness. Always, like, we're always aware of something. It's a matter of what are we aware of. And so the reason why this is important is because now we have to direct with this personal responsibility. I'm not going to be the person directing your T. I'm not going to be the person directing your time, energy, effort, and awareness. You are. So what that looks like is you understand that the baseline is what you get to explore or discover. Now that's important because remember, the first thing that we established after personal responsibility was ownership over our identity. The second thing was what accounts for it, right? So if our identity is a baseline, then what accounts for it is EEI, which is emotions, experiences, and information, right? Why? Because from the beginning of time, these things already exist. Now, the emotions may not be outside of us, but from the moment you're born with emotions. You came out of your mother's womb probably crying, right? And if you didn't cry outside of a room, shortly after, you know what I'm saying? So emotions are they've always been present from your origin. Emotions, you came into the world with emotions. Everything happens through our experiences, right? So just think of how we navigate life experientially, right? And then information. Information kind of covers everything in a nutshell. Data, information, right? So it's going to be what you subscribe to, what you don't subscribe to. Just think of it. We live in an information world. You know, I believe our world is oversaturated with information, right? But when you take personal responsibility and you and you're empowered to exercise ownership over your identity, you now know what accounts for how you identify emotions, experiences, and information. But the good news is, this is where I want to introduce love, the expanded definition of love. We're now introducing a way for you to go in your baseline, right? Your baseline identity, emotions, experiences, and information, and measure what's inside of it, right? So you're going to do an audit. You're going to go into your identity and you're going to kind of explore. This is not the idea of reliving anything, right? The first thing I want to establish around this work is understanding that now that I've introduced love, and we're going to talk about love a little bit before I move forward, but I want to make sure you understand that love is always safe. Love was here before we were here. So you're not doing this work by yourself. You're not doing this work outside of yourself. And you're not navigating this process without support. Okay? So that's important, right? So I don't want you to be intimidated. I don't want you to think that this is the idea of going too far ahead, going too far back. This is the idea of being very much present, but being very much conscious of love being active, present, and always providing a way back. Now, what is love? Okay, because I just threw love in there. I didn't do any reference. I didn't make love relative to anyone or anything yet, right? So I'm going to take a pause and time out because I want to ask you in real time, how do you define love? And I want you to take about a couple seconds, not more than a minute. So this is going to be a surface level answer. But I want you to take a moment and really, really, see what accounts for how you define love. Okay? So I'll wait. So how I define love, because love is very functional, love is relational. And this is what I have discovered about love. I didn't always know this, right? So these are things that I've discovered, and I'm still discovering more about how love works. So we're going to take love, which is the framework of emotional and experiential language. Love, we're going to pull from 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. Now, this is not Bible study, but the only thing I'll kind of interject and say is, to disclose is that the source of emotional and experiential language is, of course, my personal relationship with love, God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, and the Bible, right? So when you hear me reference the Bible, I want to make a disclaimer. Again, this is not Bible study, but the source, the framework for emotional and experiential language is rooted in Scripture, right? So this is where we learn how the Word of God functions relative to living emotionally healthy, okay? So if you're not a believer, I don't want you to turn me off. I don't want you to shy away from this. I want you to be open, right? Because this is a model. This is still a way for you to go into your belief system, right? And really, really activate your awareness around how it is functioning for you or how it is not functioning for you. And if you are a believer, this is where you can activate your awareness around your personal responsibility for operating from love and what that actually looks like. So it's for everybody in essence, right? So, okay, the expanded definition of love highlights that love is not confined to a feeling. Now, why is this important? Because Google defines love, right? And by now you should have your definition on the table, right, about love. But Google describes love as a strong, intense feeling. The other thing I want to highlight around love is that we all have a relative, we've invented love, right? And why do I say that? Because we all have a definition and idea of love that is relative to emotions, experiences, and information, but not relative to the source. How do we know that? No one's definition of love is the same. It might be good, but it's not the same. The next question is, how is your invention or your definition of love, how is it working for you? And I pause on purpose because I really want you to take the time to digest and process that. And the reason why is because love is the language to speak back to our emotions. Now in EEL, emotional language is the idea of understanding that our emotions have a voice. They're always speaking or suggesting something to us. They're always active, right? And emotional language is the idea of understanding that our experiences carry meanings, right? We're oftentimes identifying, operating. Those meanings are defining us versus developing us. And they're also not becoming a bridge for us to learn how to relate to love, right? And so we have to, that's what we're going to be learning. So I've kind of gone a little bit ahead, but now, I already established EEL from the beginning, but now I'm creating a bridge from our emotions to love. Now, in the spirit of EEL, we understand that every emotion has the capacity to disrupt, to break our consciousness, our awareness in any given moment, right? So that would look like in any given moment, we can be disconnected from ourselves. And so what does that mean, Zephaniah? Our emotions oftentimes function as a barrier. But in emotional and experiential language, we're going to learn how they are a bridge. We don't want our emotions to be a barrier. Because what does a barrier do? It's like a block. It's like, I'm here and I have a barrier and then I can't get across, right? And so if I'm disconnected from myself, and that happens through my emotions, because in any given moment, my emotions have the capacity to disrupt my consciousness, right? And this is good, bad, or ugly. Then how do I reconnect to myself, right? If I'm now separated. And this is where love comes in at, because if we have language to speak back to our emotions, right? Language that is functional, right? Language that is relative to the source, that is consistent, right? And when I say consistent, EEI is not consistent because EEI is relative to you, right? So emotions, experiences, and information is unique to the individual. So there's no consistency in that. Meaning my EEI and your EEI baseline is going to look different, because whatever triggered my emotions, stimulated my emotions, right, signaled my emotions, may not be the same thing. And even if it is the same thing, it still may look different on me. And we all have different experiences, right? So this is where I kind of want to introduce the idea of relating to something versus identifying, right? Relationship relative to EEL, right? Everything that I'm talking about is relative to emotional and experiential language. So for the purpose of teaching this, I want to reference that, right? So relationship is the idea of connection, meaning you plug something in, you take it out, right? That's something you can do and undo, right? But you have to be intentional, right? But once you plug it in, it activates your awareness around how it's functioning, right? If you plug your outlet in, if you put your plug into the outlet and you don't get any power, then you understand that it's not functioning, it's not working, right? If you put the plug into the outlet and you get power, boom, it's working, right? So that's just kind of like reference. That's important because I can relate to something without identifying with it, because identity is more relative to agreement, right? So I identify as an athlete. That's more relative to what I'm in agreement with. And that's going to be unique to me, right? All athletes are different. So what I want to highlight around that is you always want to function from a space of being empowered. So you might tell me your story and I can choose, in the spirit of EL, I can choose to relate to it, connect to it. But that doesn't mean I'm in agreement with it. I don't have to identify with it, right? So when we talk about our emotions having a voice, right, and wanting to be heard, I want to introduce the idea of us learning how to relate to our emotions, connecting to them, right, where it's now an experience and there's an exchange, versus taking them on as an identity, becoming them, right? Becoming the very essence and expression of our emotions, where we're not expressing them, but we are becoming them. And what does that look like? Good, bad, and ugly, right? Because our identity is who we are, not how we are. So I'm about to wrap up. It took me a long time to get into my flow, but in the beginning of this class, I said that our identity is directive. It's how we operate. So the how needs to be consistent, but the how has to be relative to a baseline that is consistent. Now, I already established that EEI looks different for everyone, so there's no consistency in that. But it is a baseline, meaning it is the origin of how we identify. So think of how, think of what you like, what you don't like, where you go, where you don't go, what you believe in, what you don't believe in, right? EEI is relative to all of that, because that's what accounts for that. When you think of your belief system is cultivated, meaning your belief system is established. But when you are exercising ownership, you now use your resources in a way that reflects that. So this is where you're taking time, energy, effort, and awareness to always own how you are in any given moment. Because how you are is not who you are. Because you're always doing the work to reflect who you are, not how you are, because that is EEI. That's not consistent. So the reason why I introduce love relative to the source of love, God is love. This is where I introduce 1 Corinthians 13, 4-8. But in essence, it's the very nature of God. So this expanded definition of love just highlights a piece, right? This just gives us language, some language, but this is where we understand love is something that we discover. We don't create it, we don't invent it. And I believe that the power, purpose, and impact of love is rooted in our capacity to make love relative to the source of love, God. Because the power of love is God, right? He describes himself as love. But now that gives us so much more to work with relative to how we engage our emotions. So they're no longer a barrier, but a bridge. Because we're now learning how to relate to love, just like we're learning how to relate to our emotions, right? And our identity is sustained from a baseline that is constant and consistent, because the word doesn't change. EEI is always changing. Emotions, experiences, and information is always changing, which is going to justify how we are in any given moment. But what I want to highlight around that is experience. That is experiential. That is not our identity. And if our identity is directive, I'm honing in on that. Remember, if our identity is directive, then it's important that we know what accounts for it, and it's important that we have a way to measure, right? What is the scale for everything that is in us? What scale do we use to measure what accounts for how we identify? Love becomes that scale, because love is not relative to EEI. Love is relative to God. Right? And so again, even if you're not a believer, I'm about to close, but even if you're not a believer, I don't want you to shy away from being open to this, because this is still a model for you to go into your current belief system, or however you identify right now, and understand that emotions, experiences, and information is accounting for that. And this is also a way for you to take ownership, right? And ask yourself, well, how do you measure what is right and true? How do you know what to keep? Right? What is developing your capacity to become who you are? And have you justified who you are by how you are? Right? So think of any emotion you've experienced. Think about how we make decisions. Think about how we recognize the choices we have, right? So before you have choices, you got to make a decision. Once I decide to eat, then I choose what I'm going to eat. Once I decide I believe in love, then I choose relative to that decision, right? Once I decide I don't want to, once I decided I wanted to go to school, then I recognize the choices around that decision, right? So once you decide to take ownership, now you choose how to operate. And it's not going to be from how you are, it's going to be from who you are. So the how becomes an experience that you can connect to, but not operate from. Now, this is not easy, but this is why I said earlier, love is the bridge. Love is the way to navigate that space. Love is consistent. Love is safe. Love is always present. It's always active. And it always provides a way back. Back to what? Back to you. Back to love. Right? So I hope this helps. I'm going to wrap it up right here. I'm getting a little hot. I've said a lot, but the main takeaway here, if you want to activate EEL in your life, the first thing you have to do is make a decision. And that decision is going to make room for your choice. Now, you can choose to exercise ownership, right? You can choose to exercise awareness in motion. You can choose how you direct your time, energy, effort, and awareness, right? Because now you understand how your emotions, experiences, and information function. They are a baseline. But when you decide that you want to use EEL, you're also deciding to agree with love. So now love becomes relational, love becomes functional, love becomes the how. Right? And it reflects who you are because you have a baseline that is constant and consistent and never changing. And so the inspiration for EL is Proverbs 4, verse 23. Above all things, guard your heart. I will see you next time. And thank you for bearing with me in this class. Bye.